Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be tackling this big 9-drawer walnut mid-century dresser. And as you can see, the top of this is completely shot. There are areas of failing finish, areas where there is no finish, watermarks and rings. And then this big chunk here at the end where there's actually a big piece of veneer torn off. She definitely needs some love, but I'm going to be restoring this whole piece, so stick around. My name is Angie and I refinish furniture. Sometimes I paint and sometimes I don't, but I always do what I can to save old pieces from the trash. Welcome to my workroom. So some of you might recognize this scraper from one of my last videos where I talked about essential tools. This video was shot before that one, so at this point I haven't used this yet. This was a gift from Joe Martin off my Amazon wishlist. I've seen a lot of other furniture refinishers using it, and I have to say I absolutely loved it. I loved having that little handle. It just gives you a little bit of extra control. The carbide tip is very sharp, very strong, and made easy work of this finish. As with any wood scraper, you want to make sure you're scraping completely flat and that you don't have one side or the other digging down a little bit too much. You want to scrape in one direction. I personally like to pull toward me, and you absolutely want to go very easy on the edges. You really don't need a whole lot of pressure with these. I know they seem scary, I was scared of them at first too, but with a little bit of practice, they're actually not that hard to use. Why am I scraping as opposed to stripping or sanding? Scraping is my preferred method of finish removal when, or I should say especially when the finish is kind of failing and flaky like this is. It just goes so fast, it's way less messy than stripping, and because this walnut wood grain is actually a wood veneer, I want to do as little damage as possible. These are the original legs to the piece, so of course I'm going to be reusing them. And looking at the drawers now, there are 3 screw holes on the back. I don't know if this piece is glued down to the veneer facing. I hope it's not, but it'll be a lot easier to refinish these with those off. So I am going to try one. I'm going to try taking the handle off and seeing how easy that is and going from there. And there is one plastic guide here I have to replace. All the others are intact. This is a good time to have a look at your drawers, make sure that there aren't damages. In this case, this guy has a split on the bottom, so I'm going to be using some wood glue, and this wood glue was a gift from Cindy Barr from my Amazon wishlist, so thank you so much for this, Cindy. I go through a ton of wood glue, so this is obviously very useful to me. I'm starting first by putting a little bit of wood glue under the glue block. It had completely dried up and separated from the bottom of the drawer. And then just pushing down so that the glue squeezes out and removing some of the excess, and then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here in the split, making sure that all of the surfaces are covered. So I actually had 2 drawers that were split in the same way, so I've glued and clamped those up and I've set them aside to dry. So now I'm going to try to remove these handles. I've done many dressers like this in the past. 99% of the time they're just screwed on, but that 1% where this is actually glued on. So I'm just taking my screwdriver here, giving it a little tap. You can see it didn't work, so I grabbed my dead blow mallet, gave it a little extra oomph, and I'm being super careful here. I can already hear it That is a bummer. So these were indeed glued down. This will be the only one I'm removing. I'm going to have to try to strip and refinish all the other drawers with the handles still on them because I'm not doing this again. It's not the end of the world, but I'm gonna have to pull off any little bits of veneer that have bent and curled over so that this will lie flat again once I'm ready to put it back on. And I don't really have a choice now but to re-glue it when I do reattach it. I'm opting to use circa 1850 stripper on the rest of the piece. The finish everywhere except the top was actually still pretty intact and quite thick, so in this situation, stripping would make more sense. It would be rather difficult to scrape it, and because I have to redo these with the handles still attached, sanding the finish off is not at all an option. I'm using a metal scraper for the big flat areas, and then just some 4-0 steel wool to try to remove the rest of the finish. I find the steel wool or those little 3M scrubby pads, those work really well for taking finish off. And to get right into the groove there, I'm using a stiff nylon bristle brush. Another reason I like the circa 1850 is because it's more of a gel as opposed to a liquid, so it clings really nicely to vertical surfaces like the sides of this dresser. Some strippers are super runny and it would literally just run down the side, but I find this really works quite well. Because I already scraped the top of the dresser, I'm starting it with a 180 grit sand pad as I've already done the hard work of removing the finish. So at this point you may be wondering why I didn't just sand the finish off to begin with, and I don't always like to do that with veneers. With a veneer you only have usually a pretty thin layer of wood to work with, and when you're trying to sand through a finish and sand out scrapes and gouges, I find that often you just take off too much, and especially if you're a beginner and you're not super familiar with veneer and how to sand properly, that it's actually really easy to sand through the veneer. So most of the time, if it's a veneer, I will either strip it or scrape it prior to a light sanding before I move on to staining or whatever I'm going to be doing with the piece. So this is a thin strip of walnut veneer that I was able to salvage off a scrap piece. What I need to do is try to make this look as natural as possible. So I'm looking at the way the grain is running on the top of the dresser and trying to position this so that it looks like a natural flow onto the patch. I'm just going to trim the end off here. It's a little bit frayed, so I want a perfectly flat edge to start with, and I'll do the same on the other side, making sure that I leave enough for a slight overhang. Now I'm just going to make some straight cuts on the top of the dresser itself. I need to make sure I don't cut it too wide or my patch won't fit. Sorry for the lack of focus here on the video. I'm trying to only cut down into the veneer. I don't want to go too far into the substrate. The veneer is still really well adhered to the substrate, so I have to be a little bit careful when trying to scrape it off that I don't gouge in too far. I just applied a strip of green painter's tape here, and I'm tracing out the shape of the patch. Once I have this traced out, I'm going to pull the tape off and apply it on top of the patch, and then make my cuts with a straight edge so that I have a perfect cutout for the patch. Before I can glue this new veneer down, I want to add a little bit of fresh wood filler to make sure that this gouge at the end is level with the rest of the substrate. So I'm just going to push it in and form it with my thumb and the putty knife, try to smooth it out. While that's drying, I'm going to go and use some walnut wood filler on a few gouges in the rest of the piece. Veneer tends to sliver and fray at the edges, and while the stain would probably cover up these, I like to use wood filler where I can. This wood filler is completely dry, so I'm sanding it off, as well as the rest of the area that's going to be glued here, because I want to make sure that my new glue is going to adhere. I'm just adding some wood glue with a paintbrush here, and I also put a tiny bit on the underside of the patch. Once I have the glue applied, I'm just going to press this into place, make sure everything lines up. And I'm going to press all along here, making sure I have a good glue squeeze out on all the sides. It's imperative that this patch is glued down as perfectly, or as close to perfectly as possible. I'm adding a layer of painter's tape just to make sure the patch stays in place while I'm clamping it. And I have this board that also has painter's tape on it that I'm going to flip over. It'll help distribute the pressure of the clamps evenly along the patch. So this whole time I've been working, my drawers have been glued and clamped. They're completely dry now, so I'm going to remove all the clamps, and as you can see, I have a ton of clamps. You can never have too many clamps. It's time to get to work on sanding the drawers. The drawers didn't have as much damage as the top, so I'm going right in with my 220 grit, which is going to be the final sanding grit on the entire piece. As you know, I started off the top with 180, and then I'm going to go back through once the patch is dry and do 220. I have to be really careful here while I'm sanding not to bump the sander into the handle. Part of the handle I'm going to be hand sanding, but I am using my orbital for these big flatter areas. This is one of my favorite parts in a project, when it's all starting to come together, the damage has been repaired, and you're just working on getting everything ready for either stain or paint. And obviously in this case I'm going to be staining, but everything just looks so smooth and full of promise. I don't know, I sound cheesy saying it, but that's how I feel about it. I love restoring these pieces. Now the legs are solid wood and I'm choosing to just go right in with my sander. I could have stripped them, I could have scraped them, but I don't really have to worry about blowing through veneer here or anything like that, so just as fast for me to just go in and sand it. Now, having a look here at the top, this is after the 180 sanding, prior to the 220 sanding. So I'm assessing some of these dark spots. There's a dark water ring, there's just a few areas, it looks almost like a burn mark. I'm going to be using some oxalic acid here to try to lighten those before I stain the top. Oxalic acid is pretty easy to use. You basically just mix it in warm to hot water and brush it on. Now, you don't want to brush it over just the area that is stained. I had someone in the comment section of one of my other videos say, no, that's not true. You just do it over the stain. No, you have to do it over the entire surface that you're working on. So I don't have to do the whole piece with this, but I do have to do the whole top, if that makes sense. Oxalic acid is a wood bleach. It's not the same as household bleach. So I've been asked if you can use household bleach to do this, and in my experience, it's not at all effective. You definitely want to get proper wood bleach. When you see water rings on a piece, sometimes they're white and sometimes they're dark or black. When you see white water rings, this means that the water or heat, in some cases, has damaged the finish but hasn't damaged the wood itself. When you see rings that are dark or black, gray, these are areas where the water or heat has penetrated the finish and penetrated into the wood, and those are the ones you want to use oxalic on. Generally, white or light rings and marks, for the most part, come off when you strip, scrape, or sand the piece. You can see here, I'm barely finished doing the top here, and already that watermark, that dark ring on the left, has lightened quite a bit. The oxalic acid needs to sit on the surface until it's completely dry. In the meantime, I'm going to reattach that one handle that I unfortunately pulled off that was previously glued to the piece. So getting that back on. There was a parcel that came from Amazon, so I knew it was from my Amazon wishlist, but it didn't have a note. I have since found out that this was also from Cindy Bar. So thank you, Cindy, for these gloves. I use them all the time. They're great. Now, it's only been about 17 or 18 minutes in this video so far, but I know that for some of you it's going to feel like I'm never going to get to staining. And the reason I let this video go on a little bit longer than some of my other ones is because there is a lot of work involved in redoing a piece like this. Scraping or stripping and sanding and repairing damage and staining and resealing, it takes a long time on a piece like this. Here's another thing about oxalic acid, it absolutely has to be rinsed off. So I actually did 2 washes of water on the top and then used a shop towel to wipe off any of the excess. And I have it sitting in the sun here. You can see it's pretty much the end of the day here. You've got that sort of harsh light. But I'm going to let this completely dry up overnight before I get into staining. I'm going to be using my favorite gel stain by General Finishes called Nutmeg. This and Antique Walnut are my 2 favorite colors for mid-century furniture. Antique Walnut is a little bit more on the cool brown side, and Nutmeg is sort of a warm cinnamony color, and for this piece, I think Nutmeg is going to be perfect. So you can see quite clearly that the color of the walnut patch is slightly different than the color of the original top on the piece, and that's not all that uncommon. There's many different species of walnut, and who knows what the difference is in ages. I'm just going to stain right over it, and then if I need to do any sort of color correction, I'm going to do my best to make it blend in. Of all the different types of stains out there, gel stain is probably the most forgiving for beginners. Gel stain sits a little bit more on the surface than, say, a penetrating stain or a dye stain, so it's a little more beginner friendly. I personally love the richness of it and I guess just how easy it is to use. It's pretty much a wipe on and wipe off sort of deal. Now, this next Amazon wishlist gift I received from Scott, and I'm not going to say your last name because I'll probably screw it up, but I'll pop it up on the screen. This is basically a kit with several different types of wood paints and dyes, and these are super handy for either mixing into a neutral putty to get a perfect color, but in this case I'm actually going to be using it directly on the surface over the stain once it's dry. And my goal here is to try to help the patch blend in a little bit. I know it's not going to be perfect, but I am going to try to get it a little bit closer in tone and color. So first I'm using the walnut color and the cherry color. I'm going to mix them together and then I'll also use them separately. And then you'll see me a little while later use a bit of a darker color, and that was actually the walnut mixed with black. And I used that to try to recreate the sort of flecks in the grain. But first, I'm just trying to blend this seam a little bit better. Oftentimes, when you're doing patches like this, it's better to do a diagonal seam rather than a 90-degree one like I did here on the end. It's a little bit harder to camouflage, and honestly, I probably should have done it on an angle, but I didn't, so I'm trying to make the best of it. Whenever I do this sort of color repair, I try to go in with a lighter color first, and then I'll go in with a darker color and try to mimic the pores and the grain. Like I said, I already know this isn't going to be perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than what was already there. I'm going to be using a wipe-on poly on this as well, which has a little bit of an amber effect, so that will also help this sort of blend in a little bit and deepen the color when I put the top coat on, so I'm not overly worried about this. We're getting so close now. I'm just trying to blend in this little chip here on the side as well. Oops, and I also just noticed a little bit of gel stain that didn't come off. Now, I don't use wipe-on poly all that much anymore. I've just come to love other finishes a little bit better, but for this particular piece, I needed a little extra richness, and I find the wipe-on poly has a bit of an amber quality to it and kind of ambers over time, and especially with the top, that's really what I'm after here with this one. Now, I apply this a little bit different than a lot of people. Most people will just pour it on a rag and just give it a quick wipe all over. I like to actually sort of work it into the grain a little bit more for my first coat and then use a cloth for my subsequent coats. And I find it just makes it go a little bit faster because you're getting those wood pores filled in the first coat. Maybe this is incorrect, maybe it doesn't matter, I don't know, but I know that it works really well for me, so that's how I prefer to put this stuff on. With wipe-on poly, you generally want pretty thin coats, and you're going to need a lot more of them than a traditional finish. Something that you would use 2 or 3 coats of polyacrylic for example, you're probably going to need 6 or 7 or even 8 coats of this to get the same amount of protection and the same sheen. It just dawned on me that I didn't have any footage of staining and sealing the legs, which is odd, but I did it the same way as the rest of the piece with the General Finishes Nutmeg Gel Stain and then wipe-on poly. After doing the first coat of wipe-on poly, I did a very light sanding with a super fine grit. I think it was about a 500 or 600, somewhere in there. All I'm doing is just trying to smooth it out. Sometimes you get these little dust nibs that form. I'm just trying to knock those back. And then I did several other coats with a cloth instead of the little pad that I put the first coat on with. So let's have one more look at this crazy piece that I picked up. This was so much work, but I find these ones so rewarding. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any other flips like this. Thank you so much for watching. Let's have a look at this piece now.